All right. So our Lunch and Learn presenter today is Elena Marie Rosario. She's a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Michigan and a public historian. Her dissertation project focuses on Puerto Rican migration and settlement in Hartford, Connecticut during the post-World War II era, and it pairs in-depth archival research with community-centered methodologies such as oral histories and community engagement projects. Her research interests include labor, education, urban development, social movements, and identity formation. Elena is a member of Hartford's Puerto Rican community and received her BA from Connecticut College in 2014. So welcome, Elena. We're so happy to have you today. So I'll let you get started.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that introduction. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Oh, let me let my sister in first. All right. So thank you, everyone, for being here today. I would like to start by thanking Connecticut Historical Society for allowing me this space to present about my research and my work, and thank all of you for being here. I also would like to start the presentation by acknowledging that the land that we currently gather on here in Connecticut, for those of you who are here, is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples. They have stewarded this land for generations, and this region remains the homeland of many indigenous groups. I seek to reaffirm and respect contemporary and ancestral ties to this land through words of acknowledgement. This presentation will apply social history frameworks to highlight Puerto Rican settlement and community engagement in central Connecticut during the mid-20th century. I will show how everyday lived experiences and social interactions in Hartford aided Puerto Ricans in their settlement around the state, providing a detailed history of the Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade. Will show how the organization became a key site for Puerto Rican social, cultural, and political expression in the state. I place primary sources such as city and state records, newspapers, and oral histories in conversation with secondary sources from history, Puerto Rican studies, and public science and political science to help me tell this story. Puerto Rican settlement in Greater Hartford must first be put into context with post-war Puerto Rican migration to Connecticut. There's no doubt that Puerto Ricans moved to and settled in the state before the Second World War. However, the numbers were relatively small and barely reported. May 1952 marks the beginning of a significant increase in Puerto Rican migration to the state. As labor demands continued to escalate throughout the post-war years, officials from Puerto Rico's Department of Labor offered a solution through their Bureau of Employment and Migration Division. The first group of about 200 Puerto Ricans came to work primarily in the tobacco industry as contracted laborers through the Connecticut Shade Tobacco Growers Agricultural Association. And here on the slide, you have some pictures. The first picture is of a tobacco plantation, and you can see the cheesecloths hanging over the tobacco plants, and that's why it's called shade tobacco. And the picture in the center is from inside of a plane bringing Puerto Ricans over from the island to New York. And the last photo on your screen is a view of Bradley Airport in 1956. So this is the view that Puerto Ricans would have been seeing as they arrived in the state. The Puerto Rican communities of Greater Hartford were formed through the deliberate recruitment of Puerto Ricans as migrant farm workers to New England. And the number of Puerto Ricans arriving and staying continued to increase throughout the 1950s. In 1955, the Migration Division opened a regional office in Hartford. Along with other local organizations, this office worked with Puerto Ricans as they settled in the state to obtain better access to housing, education, and jobs. The Migration Division employees felt that one way to integrate Puerto Ricans into a Connecticut society was through educating the non-Puerto Rican population about Connecticut's newest arrivals. Puerto Ricans wanted to address issues that affected their everyday lives. Race and ethnicity impacted the city's spatial ordering and physical segregation and how people created their communities. In addition to navigating America's racial landscape as a multiracial group, Puerto Ricans also face discrimination because of their language barrier. And so here on the screen, there is a table from a book on Puerto Rican migration. And as you can see on the top of this table is Connecticut, and it shows between 1955 and 1961, the number of Puerto Ricans that participated in the farm placement program. And so you can see that the numbers just keep increasing from the original 200 that we had in 1952. And then on the other side of the screen here are just some headlines from local Connecticut newspapers, what was happening and what they were talking about as Puerto Ricans were arriving in the 1950s. In 1963, the Hartford Times newspaper reported about 3,000 to 5,000 Puerto Ricans living in the city of Hartford. Many congregated in the city's North End neighborhoods, specifically in the Clay Arsenal and Asylum Hill areas. Housing discrimination at the time was common, and most Puerto Ricans, like other Caribbean migrants arriving in the area, moved to the city's northern neighborhoods. This was because this was one of the few areas where landlords would rent to Puerto Ricans and other people of color. This did not necessarily mean that they were good conditions or housing conditions, but that people were allowed to live in this area. So thus, the largest concentration of Puerto Ricans ended up being located primarily near the intersection of Albany Avenue and Main Street, right outside of downtown Hartford, Connecticut. And the images that you see here on your screen are of Puerto Ricans civically engaging in the Hartford community in the 1960s. So the first image is of a group called the Puerto Rican Civic League, which actually started in the 1950s, meeting with the mayor of Hartford, Mayor Kinsella, in 1965. And the other picture on the screen is Maria Sanchez and Alejandro La Luz, who were both integral parts of the Puerto Rican Day Parade Committee and just Puerto Rican organizers and activists in Connecticut. In 1964, a small group of community members in Hartford planned the first Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade. Inspired by the success and achievements of the New York Parade, which started in 1958, and actually this past weekend, just after 2 years because of COVID, just started up again this past weekend, celebrating a huge, I think it's 60 something, like 63rd anniversary this year of the New York Parade. And so the Connecticut Parade was inspired by the New York Parade, and also driven to make changes and better themselves and Puerto Ricans throughout Connecticut. This group, which started out, with just a group of less than a dozen Puerto Ricans, ended up becoming one of the biggest and most well-known cultural events that the city has to this day. The group members developed a local committee in Hartford and went around to all the different Puerto Rican communities in the state to ensure the formation of an inclusive state committee. Jose Cruz Vasquez served as the first president of the Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade. The Central Committee, who were many of the original members of the small group from Hartford, included Cruz Vasquez as chairman, Julian Vargas as vice chairman, Mariano Cortez as treasurer, and Maria Colon Sanchez as vice treasurer. Unfortunately, I have yet to find a complete roster to inform us of who all was at the first meeting or in these first early committees, but so far, some of the names I've been able to discover. And so I share them with you. In addition to the parade's larger message of promoting voter registration, early parade organizers were interested in providing leadership and community development opportunities to all Puerto Ricans. They hoped that by creating solidarity among themselves, they could access political recognition and support in the issues they faced in present-day Connecticut. In a letter to Governor Dempsey from June of 1964, Gilberto Camacho, the Migration Division's field representative for the Hartford office, highlights a tentative schedule for the parade and provides a sample program for the day's events. Camacho also informs the governor that in addition to Hartford, several other Connecticut towns and cities are represented in the event's organization, including New Britain, Meriden, Waterbury, South Norwalk, Bridgeport, New Haven, Wallingford, Guilford, and Stamford. There was more correspondence about the upcoming parade in early September. Another letter from Camacho to the governor points to specific examples from other nearby states that honored Puerto Ricans with a declared day, like New York and New Jersey. It also points to the city of Waterbury, which raised the Puerto Rican flag at their city hall to celebrate Puerto Rico Constitution Day, which was July 25th. Moreover, representatives from the Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade asked for an official proclamation from Governor Dempsey. A proclamation would acknowledge the Puerto Rican population in the state and their contributions to the economy and the fabric of Connecticut directly from the governor. Governor Dempsey complied and sent his official proclamation to Gilberto Camacho at Hartford's Migration Division on September 23, 1964. The Democratic governor hoped that the parade and the state's dedication of a Connecticut Puerto Rican Day would help, and I quote, foster great understanding and cooperation, end quote, between Puerto Ricans and their fellow Connecticut citizens. And on the screen here, I have two Puerto Rican flags for those of you who study Puerto Rico. One of the flag with the light blue is from 1895, and the other flag that is more common that you've probably seen is from 1952. And this is just to show that even though I'm talking about Puerto Ricans as a big collective group, we are a diverse group. And so even at the very first Puerto Rican Day Parade, there was probably both of these flags presented, just like at the current Puerto Rican Day Parade. There are these flags and also the all black and white resistance flag as well. In conjunction with the parade and march to Dillon Stadium, 4 queens were named as representatives for their communities across the state. The parade's organizers held coronations and pageants for the queens and benefit dances to raise money in Bridgeport and Hartford. The governor's proclamation was officially published in local newspapers on October 1st. Governor Dempsey invited the public to watch and attend the Puerto Rican Day Parade events in Hartford. He also said, and I quote, "The members of the Puerto Rican community in our state are to be commended for their interest in the rights and responsibilities of their American citizenship," end quote. Sacred Heart Catholic Church, located at 49 Winthrop Street in Hartford, near the intersection of Eli and Main Streets, is an important location for this story for several reasons. It is the physical place where Puerto Ricans came to worship, gather, discuss ideas, and organize throughout the 20th century. It is also the place where the concept for the very first Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade was planned. Coincidentally, outside of its doors is where the first Puerto Rican Day Parade began. And so here on the screen, you see a map. And this map, I made this using ArcGIS. And so the little people are to tell you where the parade intersections happened. And so the parade started at Sacred Heart Church, and parade participants marched up the street from Sacred Heart to up Eli Street and took a left down Main Street. From there, they continued south down Main Street until they turned left on Charter Oak Avenue, marching east. And then they turned right onto Horse Shop Avenue and continued to the end of their parade, which was at Dillon Stadium. Participants included Boy Scout troops, musicians, civic organizations, queens, and community members. Puerto Rican flags waved back and forth in participants' and onlookers' hands. Hartford's first Puerto Rican Day Parade queen was Lucky Dudikoff. And there's a picture of her here on your screen that I was able to find with the help of Marie Heher, who is on the call right now. So thank you, Marie. And Lucky was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and raised in central Connecticut. She was a student at Plainville High School while she was the first Puerto Rican Day Parade queen. And interesting enough, in case people, are interested in how participating in some of these events, the impact that it had on individuals, I actually was able to pull up Lucky's obituary, and in it, they mentioned that she was the first Puerto Rican Day Parade queen. And so it was something that she was very proud of in her life. And I would love to do some more research on her, but I was really excited when I read that. So the first Puerto Rican Day Parade took place on October 4th, 1964, and the theme was Register to Vote. The parade lasted about an hour. In addition to the parade organizers who spoke at the mass meeting after the parade at Dillon Stadium, several Connecticut politicians from both major parties spoke and encouraged Puerto Ricans to participate in local and state politics. Parade organizers had expected about 5,000 people to attend on this fall day, but reports say that almost 20,000 people watched the first Puerto Rican Day Parade as it traveled through Hartford streets. 3,000 people participated in the mass meeting at Dillon Stadium to hear more about ways that Puerto Ricans could participate and participate and get involved in the community. Overall, over 75 Puerto Rican organizations around the state of Connecticut participated. Some of them include, and are still present to this day, the Spanish Action Coalition, the Puerto Rican American Association of Connecticut, the Puerto Rican Society of Hartford, and the Puerto Rican Civic League of Hartford, which you saw a picture of in a few slides ago. In July of 1965, a New York Spanish language newspaper, El Diario La Prensa, published this photo of Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade Committee members meeting at the Migration Division's New York office. This image is from the Connecticut Historical Society's Hispanic collection gathered by Dr. Ruth Glasser. And here on the screen, you can see that there are some annotations of who's here. Some of these are names that we've already heard, or you will hear. So Maria Sanchez, Alejandro La Luz, and Armando Baez are some. This image is just a few members of the parade's committee, as it now boasted over 24 members from around the state. Puerto Ricans from Bridgeport and Willimantic took on leadership roles this year to provide more opportunities for folks who wanted to be involved. Two of the founding organizers continued to serve in leadership positions. Jose Cruz Vasquez, now vice president, while Maria Colon Sanchez remained secretary. Parade chairman Armando Baez, who you see on your screen here, wrote to Governor Dempsey about the 1965 parade in July and August. He noted the primary goal this year was to encourage voter registration, and the secondary goal was to call for a mutual understanding and recognition of Puerto Rican strength politically and culturally in the state. The second annual Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade was held on September 5th, 1965 in Bridgeport. The parade began at 2 p.m. and was primarily sponsored by the Puerto Rican Association of Bridgeport. Committee members from the New Haven community were chosen to lead the parade and make the final selections for the state's queen. Ada Benitez of New Haven was selected as Miss Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade Queen. One parade float highlighted the 8 districts of Puerto Rico that year, with 8 young women representing each region from Hartford, Waterbury, Meriden, and Bridgeport. Governor Dempsey also issued another statement and praised that the association and praised the organization for its efforts in helping Puerto Ricans situate themselves in life in the state. Excuse me. The third Puerto Rican Day Parade was organized to unify the state's growing population. This time, 6 towns and cities were represented in the leadership: Hartford, Waterbury, New Britain, Meriden, Willimantic, and New Haven. Hartford crowned, this year, each city had its own Puerto Rican Day Parade queen. Hartford crowned its 1966 Puerto Rican Day Queen on Saturday, September 17. Hartford's queen, Awilda Cordova, went on to compete for the state title against women from other cities. They were judged on their beauty, education, personality, and knowledge of Puerto Rican culture. Awilda was ultimately crowned Miss Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Queen. Born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, she was a resident of Hartford and an employee of the city's welfare department. Miss Cordova was also a student at Morse College of Business in Hartford at the time. The third Puerto Rican Day Parade was held on October 9th, 1966, and attended by more than 10,000 people who lined Waterbury streets to watch as marchers went by. Unfortunately, I was unable to find any images of the 1966 Puerto Rican Day Parade. So on the screen, both of these images are from the 1967 parade, which took place on September 27th, 1967. In 1967, leaders of the Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade organized a Puerto Rican Week. The week ran from September 16th through the 24th. It included a banquet, coronation ball, parade, and a festival. The parade took place on September 24th, which was also the official day declared by the government. The parade took place in Hartford for the second time, and it began at an intersection of Main Street near West Avon Street, which no longer exists. It's about 3 blocks away from Sacred Heart Church. And they continued down Main Street towards Capitol Avenue and turned onto Trinity Street and ended up at Hartford's Bushnell Park for the festival. Over 3,000 people participated in the parade, representing over 10 Connecticut cities and towns. In addition to floats, marching bands, and civic and social organizations, this year, a Puerto Rican children's color guard called Las Banderas joined. The parade lasted an hour, and the crowd was estimated to be around 12,000. So here on your screen, there are the pictures from the 1967 Puerto Rican Day Parade. The first float is with the young Queens of Hartford, and it was a float that was sponsored by the Spanish American Association. And so you can see all the queens in there waving. And the next picture you see on the screen is of all the queens and their corps in 1967, the older queens, and you could see the decorated float. A few years after planning the first Puerto Rican Day Parade, the Puerto Rican Parade of Connecticut Incorporated was a thriving cultural organization. The Central Committee met directly with Hartford's mayor, and Uccello to address the group's goals moving forward. They were already surpassing their original mission to encourage political awareness and participation among members of the Puerto Rican community in Connecticut. In 1968, the Hartford Courant estimated that about 75,000 Puerto Ricans lived in the state, spread over at least 13 cities and towns, out of a population of a little under 3 million. The fifth annual Puerto Rican Day Parade promoted civic participation and highlighted the positive contributions of Puerto Ricans in the state. The parade was hosted by the city of New Haven on September 29, 1968. The mayors of New Haven and Hartford led the parade and spoke highly of their city's large Puerto Rican populations and their contributions. Miss Puerto Rican Day Parade of Connecticut, Linda Ortiz, was from Hartford and worked as a clerk and at the Travelers Insurance Company. The parade also featured several floats depicting images of culture and society in Puerto Rico and lasted about 2 hours. So before I continue to talk about the other parades, I want to use this moment as you're looking at this screen that has probably the most words so far of all the screens that you've seen today, to talk about one of the biggest challenges that historians face, and that is when it comes to archives and what is archived and what people think is important. And so as I've done this work, which I've done for many years, and you've seen some of it, one of the things that has been really frustrating is the lack of images or archives or sources available. And so of all the images that I see, there's so many images that are not there, whether or not they were just not photographed at the time or they were not collected, is one of the big issues. And so this fifth Puerto Rican Day Parade, I have similar to the 1966 parade, there was no images that I could find. I was able to find articles and other things. And this is a really big challenge. And so I wanted to point that out to you all, because part of doing this work is to also highlight that even though this was happening and people were already addressing the Puerto Rican contributions, we still, 40 years later, we're still trying to piece together what the story was, because it wasn't properly archived. And so that is a story that, we are doing as a community, and that I'm really lucky to be able to do. So thank you for being on this journey with me. With that said, of all the Connecticut Puerto Rican Day parades in the 1960s, the 1969 parade was the most publicized and documented. This parade, unlike the others, while every other Puerto Rican Day parade invited governors from the state, from Connecticut, from other local states, and the governor from Puerto Rico, this was the first Puerto Rican Day parade that I could find evidence that governors actually really spoke and participated actively in the parade. And so before this parade, there was actually a press conference in downtown Hartford at the Hilton. And there, among many of the official speakers, the field representative from the Migration Division, Gilberto Camacho, said this quote that really stood out to me. And he said, and I quote, "What the 100,000 Connecticut Puerto Ricans really want is to say, here we are. Our roots are here now, and we are here to stay." I think this having Camacho say this in such a public way at the Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade and the official day that was recognized in downtown and at this like press conference really kind of shifted and really put the parade on the path that we see today. And that I think that's definitely the reason why the parade is still going today. I think so by 1969, there was no denying that the parade was here to stay, even just in these short years of its inception. So the 6th Puerto Rican Day Parade took place on September 28th, 1969 in Hartford, this time for the 3rd time. It was originally supposed to take place in Meriden, but for some reason unknown, it ended up switching to Hartford at the last minute. I'm not sure if they weren't able to get funding or support from the town, but it was originally planned, and there was evidence that it was planned for Meriden, and then at the last minute, it was switched to Hartford. So the parade ended up having the same route as the 1967 parade and ended at Bushnell Park. The theme for the 1969 parade was to address the need for improvements in housing, health, education, employment, and civil rights. And even though I'm giving you a very specific history of the parade and as it pertains to Connecticut, for context, at this time, Hartford had already had 3 summers of rebellions, and there was a lot of civil rights movements happening in the city. And so part of the theme for the parade definitely was influenced by the larger civil rights movement that was happening in the US, but also what was occurring in Hartford at the time. And so at this time, Hartford was also starting a chapter of the Young Lords, which was the People's Liberation Party. And they were present at the Puerto Rican Day Parade that year. The parade organizers wanted to make sure that families were able to understand the business, cultural, and industrial life in the state, and able to understand what access they had to what access they had to civic and political engagement. One thing about this particular parade, as I mentioned already, because it was so highly publicized, I would probably argue that this was probably the most well-known parade since the first one, although the first one was the most well-attended. A Hartford Courant writer did call the 1969 parade one of the grandest and most colorful parades in Hartford's history. Miss Puerto Rico, Connecticut of 1969 was Sylvia Carrasquillo of Waterbury. She was born in Puerto Rico, but settled in Waterbury via New York. She was a graduate of Waterbury High School and a first-year student at Central State College, which is now Central Connecticut State University. The festivities this year ended with a banquet like all the other years. The event took place at the Hartford Hilton Hotel, and there, Governor Dempsey said, and I quote, "The Puerto Rican Day Parade has shown the community that Puerto Ricans are wholly a part of the community." End quote. He went on to boast about a new law that he signed that would go into effect on October 1st, on that Wednesday, that would allow drivers to take their exams in Spanish. Another accomplishment of this law was that Puerto Rican drivers were now allowed to use their Puerto Rican driver's license as proof that they were legally licensed to drive, in the same way that someone from a different state could come and then get a Connecticut license, because previously to that, they would have to get recertified through everything, and it wouldn't count that they had a driver's license from the island. Moreover, Governor Dempsey concluded his speech by saying, quote, "To my mind, This is what Puerto Rican Day is all about: to show that the Connecticut community includes Puerto Ricans, and to show that the includes Puerto Ricans, end quote. 15 Connecticut cities and towns participated, and representatives this year also hailed from New London and Enfield, with their Puerto Rican populations now increasing. Between 25,000 and 35,000 people watched the parade, according to the numbers. The Puerto Rican Day Parade became a site where Puerto Ricans expressed themselves culturally and became more visible members of their Connecticut communities. Original organizers understood the role that the parade had in community development and integration. Even if they didn't understand or didn't fully comprehend what the Puerto Rican Day Parade of Connecticut would mean to the community today, the original organizers understood that the need for a parade was necessary in the state. The parade created spaces for recognition, leadership opportunities, and solidarity work that help unite and strengthen Puerto Rican communities throughout the state. It also provided Puerto Ricans in Connecticut with a space to articulate their heritage, culture, and identity. What started as a parade in Hartford grew to parades around the state, yearly pageants, festivals, cultural exhibits, balls, and banquets. Moreover, to this day, the governor continues to declare Puerto Rican Day in conjunction with the parade. And that's something that we're not sure would have happened if Gilberto Camacho and the original organizers of the parade hadn't asked the first Governor Dempsey every year to proclaim the state's Puerto Rican Day Parade. I'm not necessarily sure that we would still have that to this day. Today, in 2022, the original Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade is now called the Connecticut Institute for Community Development Puerto Rican Day Parade Incorporated, which is a very fitting title because of their early beginnings. This year, the Puerto Rican Day Parade in Hartford is scheduled for August 21st, 2022. There are also 4 other parades and festivals in Hartford, in Connecticut now. One took place this past weekend in Norwich, and there's others that will take place this summer in Fairfield County, Meriden, and New Haven. By the time I was born in Hartford in the early 1990s, the parade had become a fixture. While I did not fully comprehend the cultural significance and history behind the parade, I always enjoyed going to the event and seeing people celebrate their culture. I could tell it was an important part of my city and a part of the Puerto Rican diaspora. I hope that my work can continue to shed light on Puerto Rican contributions to Hartford and the state of Connecticut and provide more access for the public to learn about their history. And here on the screen is an image for the flyer for the Puerto Rican Day Parade this year in Hartford. And then there's a picture of me for fun from the 48th Connecticut Puerto Rican Day Parade in 2012. And I would like to thank you all, and I'm happy to address any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was amazing. That was really informative. Please, anyone have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat at this time. We're getting lots of thank yous. Anyone have any questions?
Or comments.
Or comments. I can certainly start us off today. I did have a question. You mentioned, of course, the challenges with the lack of material in archives. Can you talk about some of the research methodologies that you've had to employ to try to fill in those gaps that you found?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm very fortunate as someone who's from Connecticut, and I was able to come back here because of different fellowship opportunities. And so I've been able to really do on the ground research for the last 2.5 years. And one of the biggest things that I have done is really go everywhere. And so you really start with the first, the big names, Connecticut Historical Society, the Connecticut State Library, and then my home archive is the Hartford History Center, where I spent a lot of time, which is located at the Hartford Public Library. The Windsor Historical Society is also crucial to this story, which a lot of people, I think, just don't assume that. But many of the tobacco fields were in Windsor. So I found a lot of information about Puerto Ricans in Windsor. And I actually, during one of my first visits over there, I told them, I was like, you guys have a lot of information on Puerto Ricans, but none of this is in the guide or the catalog. And so the archivist came back and was like, okay, met with me and we talked. And so now if you go to Windsor Historical Society and you look at the shade tobacco records, they actually say that there's Puerto Rican things in it now. And so those are some of the things I would say in terms of the challenges and how to fill the gaps. I spend a lot of time reading newspapers. Some of the main newspapers that I focus on are the Hartford Times and the Hartford Courant, which are kind of the two main ones. I also look at local newspapers that are available or pamphlets, a lot of city records. So a lot of this talk is drawn from Governor Dempsey files at the Connecticut State Library, which included all the copies of the letters that he got from the Puerto Rican Day Parade organizers. But a lot of it is really just going to multiple places and just kind of searching and just really filling it out. Ancestry.com, I would say anything you can imagine. I've looked up and just trying to piece the story together. I would like to say that the Hartford History Center has been a great resource in terms of photography because they have access. They house the Hartford Times photograph collection. And so they have just troves and troves of images. And I was able to find almost all the images used in here of the people are from the Hartford Times collection.
Yeah. Well, Lisa was asking, what was your most used source of information? Was it newspapers or historical societies? So I think you answered that. I wanted to just add a question onto that. Were you able to use, are there newspapers in Puerto Rican language, in Spanish, I'm sorry, that produced by the Puerto Rican community is my question, that you're able to access that talk about the parade that was a useful source?
Yeah, so part of why I started the talk in the 1950s, which is like a whole another part of my research in terms of the migration, is to say that even though the Puerto Ricans were able to achieve all of this, right? They were only here for like 12 years when they planned the first Puerto Rican Day Parade in large numbers. And so one of the things that I think that also makes it really hard to find evidence. So later on, so for the parades in the 70s and 80s, by then you have Hartford Spanish language newspapers already out. At this time, really, I found 2 New York Spanish language newspapers that talked about the Puerto Rican Day Parade. One was the image from CHS, and the other was, I found it, but I couldn't even cite it because I don't know the name of the newspaper because it's just a random little article that says Connecticut proclaims Puerto Rican Day Parade, and it's in Spanish. Mm-hmm. In terms of, I saw the last thing that Lisa said about early participants. At this point, the earliest people that I've been able to talk to in terms of participants are from the 1969 parade. And so, I am doing an oral history with the Queen from the 1969 parade. I had hoped that it would be more available by the time this talk happened, but life happens. So by the next time I talk about this, we'll have more of her input and her oral history. But I did draw on oral histories that were previously collected from some of these people that are located at different archives, like Trinity College or the CHS.
Oh, that's great. Wow. Anthony had a question. He was asking if you could discuss the ways that the parade contributed to political power for the Puerto Rican community and the emergence of Puerto Rican elected officials in Hartford.
Yeah, so there's a great book that talks about this at length more, and I will point it out. It's by a political scientist. It's called Identity and Power. His name is Jose Cruz. I would say I focus more on the social and cultural aspects, but there's no denying that the parade led to political changes. And so one of the major things is by 1969, when you have parade leaders like Maria Colón Sanchez meeting with the Hartford mayor, they are already kind of planning leadership programs and different ways to get more Puerto Ricans involved. And Maria Colón Sanchez was one of the first Hartford Puerto Ricans really involved in government and political things. And part of the way that she was able to kind of network and meet officials to be able to run for some of those positions was through the space of the parade. Another thing that's not mentioned in this, but in 1966, so the second Puerto Rican Day Parade, the Puerto Rican actually ran, Dolores Sanchez, he was one of the first Puerto Ricans to run for Connecticut for a position. He ran for the Republican Party. But one of the things that he talks about in his running in 1966 was about, seeing more, being able to see the opportunities, the understanding that there, are different political parties, because at the time it was very much, people were like, oh, you're Puerto Rican, you go Democrat. But the parade did allow for this bipartisan. And so they did invite people from Republican and Democrats and other things. And so it definitely, I would say, created that. In terms of like elected officials, I would say a lot of that happens later in the story in Connecticut. And so I haven't done as much extensive research, but you get it's more in the 70s that you get people entering the political sphere. And I would say that definitely it's because of the leadership opportunities and development that was happening in the 50s and 60s. And the acknowledgement that, people that were doing well and being successful, the queens, they picked queens. They wanted to acknowledge women, Puerto Rican women that were getting education and educating themselves and working. And part of that, I think, also just shows that, there was this longevity of saying, we want to show this contribution and that we are here and we are leaders for the state, not just in our community. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Well, Eric is sort of a follow-up question with that. Were you able to trace wider civil rights or political activism among Puerto Rican participants in the parade?
So I would say not particularly. I would say one of the things that I found interesting, and this is more from like oral histories, which I didn't record, I'm just reading other people's transcripts. But I think like any organization, there was a lot of differences that occurred. And so one of the things that I think that is really important that I mentioned earlier in the talk, but I'll just say again, is that when it comes politically, Puerto Ricans are not just like a universal group. Politically, we're not all the same. And so one of the things that the parade actually the parade these days is able to express is that everyone can express what Puerto Rico means to them. And so I had this image on the screen that had two different Puerto Rican flags, one with the lighter blue and one with the darker blue. And then some people might have seen the more prominent flag now since 2020, the all black and white flag. And so just those three flags are showing three different political sectors that Puerto Ricans are following. And some people might have all three flags, right? Some people might have two, some people might have one. And so it's really hard to kind of like answer a question like this because so many people had different views. Throughout my research, I will say that there is examples of Puerto Ricans from Hartford, like going to the March on Washington and participating in other civil rights events. But I think it's really hard to really, talk in this monolithic way when the group is so diverse. And so the goals that every individual had were different. So someone like Maria Colon Sanchez was very interested in education. Someone like Jose Vasquez Cruz was very interested in developing Puerto Rican leaders. And so those were the types of things that they did, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Dul Marie is asking a little bit more about, I think she's referring to when you mentioned Windsor Historical Society, when they have some archival material, but it's not in their database or available to the public. Why do you think that would be?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes, I think it's that material either gets really either it gets collected or it doesn't. But then once it gets collected and it gets, you go through the original, it really is about, and I'm not a librarian and I know other people can speak better to this. But once you start collecting information and you start processing it and you put it on the shelf, oftentimes the person who did that is not working at that institution anymore. So if that person was reading the material and was like, well, they mentioned Puerto Ricans, but I don't see why that's relevant, they might not put that on the finding aid because it was a personal choice, right? And so that's part of why we need to make archives and libraries and other spaces more accessible and open to the public, is so that we as a public can go into those spaces and look through it and say, well, hey, you got this, you got that. Or we can say, hey, you don't have this. Why is it in the town that has this, why is it in the state that has the sixth largest Puerto Rican population? Is there not XYZ in the state archives, right? And so that's the questions that then we can bring as community members to them. But a lot of it is really like, you don't know what you don't know. And it's sad, but it all goes back to who the original person is. And a lot of it is, libraries need to go back, and it takes a lot of time and money, but, go back and go through what they have. And I know, the CHS is doing this right now with oral histories, right? They're trying to collect more because they've figured out what gaps they have. But it's a very long process. So
it's a lot of the catch-up game is very cumbersome. Anne has a question about, have you had any success adding to what you know and have learned by locating, maybe private family records or scrapbooks or things of that nature?
Yeah, so not for this particular, so this talk is from one of my chapters for my dissertation. For this particular chapter, I haven't yet. I'm hoping to when I interview the 1969 Queen. But I will say that for some of the earlier stuff, like I am reaching out to anyone that I do oral history with. I do ask if they have any photos or any images or anything they'd like to share, if I can copy that. And so I collect all of that. And the ultimate goal is, for when I finish my dissertation, is to kind of create or have this space that the public can access kind of the records and the information that I've gathered, so that they don't have to go to 12 state libraries. They can just go to one page and say, okay, this is where I can get information on the parade and from this year to this year.
That would be an amazing resource available for sure. Anthony had a follow-up question. Did other ethnic or racial groups respond to the emergence of the Puerto Rican community as they reflected on the parade?
Yeah, definitely. So during this time, there was also a Caribbean parade that was happening. And so I think there was, I haven't found anything, but I'm sure like today, there's always, people have different reasons. Why do you need a Caribbean parade and a Spanish parade and a Puerto Rican and a West Indian? But I think one of the things that I think the parade showed, especially because all of these early parades had so many spectators, right? So many people were like, oh, well, we know there's Puerto Ricans here, but we don't know anything. So I think just the physical like having the physical, taking up physical space in these cities allowed Puerto Ricans to really like show that they were a community. And so in some ways, I think it definitely helped other groups like reflect on their own identity and the ways that, you know, other parades. And so you do have like now, I mean, and if in Hartford in July is like a parade every weekend, like every weekend is another parade. But I think one thing that was really great was that there was a lot of solidarity between the groups. And so one thing that I did see in the 1969 parade, one of the people that was their name was pretty involved was Colin Bennett. And he was a Jamaican realtor and ended up being a politician. And he was very involved in the Puerto Rican Day Parade. And I found that really fascinating that I found his information. He was a sponsor. And so I think it definitely helped other groups, you know, understand like what kind of work they could do and also what representation looked like in the community. And created a space for other movements, you know, that started happening, and other definitely organizations. By 1969, you have Puerto Rican, you know, civil rights organizations working with Black organizations and things like that. So I think it definitely just taking up physical space and being seen made a very big impact.
Right, the visibility there would be very impactful. Anybody have any other questions? Anyone? Thank you so much, Elena. This was really very amazing, enlightening program. I can't wait to your research is done and have you come back and share more with us. That would be amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And if anyone, you know, has any family members or anybody that wants to talk about this or wants to be interviewed, I'm always looking for people to do oral histories with. So feel free to contact me. My information is on the website.
Great. You could always reach out to me and I can also pass that information along. At this time, I just wanted to take a moment and share some upcoming fun programs that we have going on. This week, this Thursday, is our first concert in our summer concert series, and it's also our Juneteenth celebration. So we have Dexter's Lab coming. The museum is open on Thursday night, so the exhibits will be open, and we do have a very special exhibit for Juneteenth, an exhibition in our Norwalk Nook. So please come check that out. And then the following Thursday, we have a panel lecture on mental health in the LGBTQ community. So we have some experts coming to talk about the challenges that the LGBT community have faced with mental health issues, in particular with COVID-19. And then the next day, Friday the 24th, we have the first of our two-part conversation. This is a virtual conversation on dementia-friendly museums. So the first part on the 24th is presented by Live Well dementia specialists, and they'll talk about the signs and symptoms of dementia. And then in 2 weeks later, on July 8th, we will have several museums, including the CHS, talk about their programming to reach this community and what other institutions might be able to get going in their own space. So we have programming for our dementia community. So those are just some upcoming things going on. Please feel free to check out our webpage for more programs. And I just want to thank everyone again for joining us today. This was great. And we have lots of lunch and learns coming up this fall. So please check out our website for that. And Elena, we would love to have you back with an update as things get rolling. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Elena.